everyone chose to do what was right in their own eyes. One woman stood alone. An immigrant, a Moabite, a young widow. Ruth. A story of 3 women left with nothing but grief. A famine that drives them from home. A daughter's promise in the darkness. And hope rising through bitter tears. In the fields of Bethlehem, watch as ordinary grain becomes the seeds of God's extraordinary plan. In a time when everyone chose what was right in their own eyes, she chose what was right in the eyes of God. And through her faithfulness, a king would rise.
Welcome. My name is David. It is a joy to be with you, to serve as your pastor. Let's open up our Bibles to the book of Ruth. That's where we're going to be, in case you missed that. By the way, Ruth is one of those books that is so short that it's okay, and this is true of any book, it's okay to turn to the table of contents. So if you're trying to find it, just turn there and, find where. It's right after Judges, if you've been with us in that series. I want to welcome those of you who are in the room, those of you joining online, maybe because of the snow or whatever. It's not an accident that you're here. In fact, in the language of Ruth, we would say it just so happened that you're here and that God is working providentially and has something for you in the midst of what we're going to look at today and throughout this study. I'm so glad that you're here. Ruth, ultimately, if you're at all familiar with it, is a love story. It's not just that. Some people have called it a theological work of art. I love that framework. But I just want to start at the beginning by saying, I am a hopeless romantic, and I believe in love at first sight. I do. One of my favorite movies in the rom-com category is You've Got Mail. We've named our dog Brinkley after the dog in You've Got Mail. And I believe in love at first sight because when I first saw my now wife, Rebecca, when we were in high school, and I was working at Kramer's IGA, it just so happened that she came in that Friday night with her friends to rent a VHS tape. By the way, a VHS tape it's about this big and it's plastic, and you would record a movie on magnetic tape that would roll up inside of it, and it just, you can Google it later if you're not familiar. But she came, it was like before Blockbuster, and I still remember where I was standing, and there was this moment, and I've shared part of this story before, but I kid you not, time stood still. Lights seemed to shine from heaven. I'm not exaggerating that. She was just highlighted. And my heart just went out to her. And I was just drawn to her in this amazing and powerful way from the very first moment that I laid eyes on her. Now, later on, my wife has made clear she had seen me in the store several times and was drawn to me as well, but that we had crossed paths multiple times before that moment. But that was the moment that God decided to open my eyes, or, whatever was going on there. But I share that because I'm going to share little pieces of that. There's this beautiful connection that we see Ruth and Boaz make. I don't mean to ruin the story if you haven't read it yet, but they get together and they have children, and God does amazing things through this. And as we look at this, I just want to start there with the book of Ruth and just kind of give you some details and overviews. If you're a note taker, you can write that down. And we're going to be looking at the first 5 verses. And as I've shared before, ancient literature, ancient books, like we have in the Bible, don't have table of contents or chapter headings like we are used to. They have intros and conclusions that give us clues to their meaning and their structure. And so we're just going to jump in and kind of see the setting of Ruth, and we're just going to look at the first 5 verses today and look at some of the themes, and then we're going to jump into the story proper next week as we continue on. Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. Now, some of you are like so thankful that we've moved on from the book of Judges, although it was rich and powerful. But here we are. It's set in the book of Judges. We're not actually leaving the book of Judges. This is set right in the middle of the book of Judges, and the famine that's happening could have been an agricultural famine, but more likely it was one of the famines due to the oppression that we saw in that downward cycle in the book of Judges. They're probably being oppressed, and the famine is because of some form of oppression. And so in the darkness of the book of Judges, there was a famine, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah, which is the southern part of the promised land there, went to sojourn in the country of Moab. Just to be clear, it's unclear whether this is a good or a bad thing. Typically, to leave the promised land in context of Joshua and Judges would be a bad thing, but it's using the same word that was used of Abraham and Jacob and Isaac sojourning. And so it's kind of left ambiguous. The name of the man was Elimelech, which means my God is king. And the name of his wife, Naomi, or pleasant. And the names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. Now, sometimes biblical words sound similar. We can group them together. Ephraim was a tribe, the tribe of Joshua. We dealt with that a lot in the book of Judges. That's Ephraim with an M. This is Ephrathites, and that's kind of like county, if you will, around the village of Bethlehem. It's just kind of a regional area. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. Now, Moab is an enemy of God. You can look at the line of Lot. It's actually the country of Moab is formed from an incestuous relationship with Lot, and it's not a friend to the people of Israel. They were at war often, or not necessarily always at war, but tensions. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her two sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other, Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her two sons and her husband. So the book of Judges has ties, the book of Ruth has ties to the book of Judges. In the time of the Judges, there's the theme all throughout the book of Judges about kingship. Remember that God is meant to be their king, that they are meant to be led by the Lord, that there's this eventual king coming. And here we see at the beginning of the book of Ruth, this hint at God is my king in the name of Elimelech. Naomi means pleasant. Ruth means friendly, or at least based on the word for friend. Interestingly, probably both in Hebrew and in the Moabite language. And I personally think that the author is Samuel. Samuel, as we saw, most likely authored Judges, Ruth, and 1st and 2nd Samuel. That's kind of the ancient assumption about the authorship of those books. But it doesn't really matter for our reason of study and interpretation. But I've spent significant time now in the book of Judges and Ruth, and I don't know how to explain it. It just feels like Samuel wrote it. There's little things, there's nuance. You almost get to know the character of an author. And I hope that as you've spent some time in Judges, and hopefully in this season ahead, you spend some time in the book of Ruth, you might feel the same way. And if you don't, we can just arm wrestle over it later. It was written, if by Samuel, after David was anointed king, and you can see that in 1 Samuel, but before Samuel died, and therefore before David took the throne. Obviously, there's always final editing and details that are inserted after a work is finished, kind of final editing, but probably sometime around 1000 BC. The events of Ruth take place during the book of Judges, probably between chapter 3 and chapter 10, so about 1200 to 1250. You can't know for sure. The reason is chapter 3 in the book of Judges is about a Moabite king, King Eglon. He was the guy who was so overweight that the dagger swallowed up. You remember that whole account from the book of Judges? He's from Moab, and so it wouldn't have been before that time or during that time because they were basically at war. But after that oppression was thrown off, and probably before Jair in chapter 10 is kind of the setting of the book of Ruth. So even though it comes at the end of the book of Judges, we're kind of going back in that time period, and we're looking at the account in the midst of this darkness of God working. Let me just kind of give you the structure, the summary. There's 4 chapters. And I would encourage you to read and reread the book of Ruth. And here's why. Anytime we study a book, it's important. When you have 20-some chapters in the book of Judges, reading and rereading can take a little bit of effort. The 4 chapters of the book of Ruth are going to be easy. And the more that you read through it, the more you're going to appreciate the beauty that is the book of Ruth. People who study ancient literature have referred to this book as the Mona Lisa of literature in the ancient world. It is beautiful. It is symmetrical. It is structured with just the perfect amount of dialogue and the perfect amount of characters. There's only 3 main characters, Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. Everybody else fades into the background or they're unnamed. And in this beautiful way, it moves through these 4 chapters, these scenes, and you have the return here in chapter 1. And then it moves on to it just so happened that Ruth gleans in Boaz's field. And then there's the threshing floor and kind of the marriage proposal or the indication of marriage. And then chapter 4 at the city gates and the taking off of the shoe. And we'll kind of learn all about what redemption means and looks like. And the beautiful ending where they marry. And what started with emptiness here in chapter 1 ends with fullness and blessing by the end of the story of Ruth. God is working, and there's some key themes. If you want to write down some of these themes, look for them, listen to them. There's kingship. It's in the background. It's mentioned at the beginning and it's mentioned at the end. And in the course of the canon, this of course serves as the bridge chronologically between the book of Judges and the monarchy. It shows us there's a coming king, King David. First King Saul and then King David. Where does King David come from? And this story tells us what are the king's roots? What's his ancestry? But also later on, the Jewish canon changed the order, or it wasn't set as much yet, and it was placed directly after Proverbs because some of the language of Ruth directly ties with the virtuous and noble woman at the end of Proverbs. And you see this beautiful connection there, but there's kingship. There's also providence and human initiative. You and I, when we read scripture, it's not uncommon that we encounter miracles, right? You know, scripture tells us the works of the Lord and the great things that he's done. There are no miracles in the book of Ruth, but what we see is the miracle of providence. And in a sense, the author is zooming in on a normal village with just a normal farmer and this family that's gone through tragedy. And we see them kind of live out their life in this way, but it is at God's hand. And this is important because this is how we often experience God. We don't experience God showing up with choirs of angels or speaking audibly to us and telling us to do things. We experience his direction through the law of God and through providence. It just so happened. And that God works through those situations and knits things together. And there's an intersection between the human initiative and God's providence. And we're going to be looking at how that plays out. There's also covenant obedience. Covenant obedience. That's just a way of saying they were Torah observant. They followed the law of God. The Torah, typically sometimes referred to as the first 5 books, are the law of God, the instruction of God. As we saw in the book of Joshua, right after they received the law and they're entering the promised land, one of the themes of the book of Joshua was that they just followed God's instruction. They were obedient. They were obedient to this covenant. They made this covenant with the Lord God Almighty. And they weren't just obedient, they were creative in their obedience. When there were roadblocks to them honoring God, they figured out how to do it. In the book of Joshua, we just see the people being creative in their obedience. In the book of Judges, we experience the opposite. They are creative in their disobedience. They are going above and beyond to break almost every single command in the Torah as you work yourself through the book of Judges. And now we're back to, in a very normal, kind of agrarian way, the people of God in this village and in this account go out of their way to obey the law of God, and they see the blessing of God released. Then there's 2 major themes. redemption. And we're going to be looking at that in the chapters ahead. That's one of the things that happens. Ruth and Naomi are redeemed, and we're going to be looking at what that means and what does that mean for us. And then finally, the other is this key word. And if you're a note taker, it's the second thing I want you to write down. The book of Ruth, key word, chesed. And I spell it with a K. Often you'll see it H-E-S-E-D. Hesed or Hesed. And you put the K on there, and if you're having problems clearing your throat, you can just practice right now. Chesed, you kind of get that out, kind of in that guttural chesed. And this is this beautiful word in the Hebrew language that talks about the loyal love of God Almighty. It's one of the major themes in the book of Ruth, but it's subtle. The word is only mentioned 3 times, but it comes at key points in the story and in the narrative. The first time we see it in verse 8, we're going to be looking at this section in detail next week, but jump down to verse 8 with me. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May Yahweh deal kindly with you. May the Lord chesed you as you have dealt with the dead and with me." And it's this moment, and there's some kind of literary attention on that phrase, because normally in a reciprocal society like the ancient Near East, there would have been, you show love to me, I show love to you. And so they were helping Naomi, and Naomi was helping them. And so she's sending them back, telling them to stay in Moab, but she's praying, she offers this prayer that the Lord would show his chesed on them. And by the end of the book, God answers that very prayer, very specific prayer, by giving her a husband, by blessing her. And by the end of the book, that prayer is answered, but not in the way that they pictured in that moment. This word is so important that I'm kind of telling you the underlying word in the original Hebrew. And part of it is because it's one of the major themes of all of the Old Testament, and it carries into the New Testament, although in a different language. And I could spend the next 20 minutes kind of explaining this and walking you through this. But there's a great ministry called the Bible Project, and they make amazing videos that he's going to do it in just like 4 minutes. So I want to watch this word study, if you will. Feel free to take notes. There's a lot of information. We'll have it for you throughout the week and throughout the series on this word. Let's take a look.
If you tried to describe what God is like, it could be difficult or daunting. But when the people who wrote the Bible pondered the mystery of God, they consistently describe God's character in this way: compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness. We're going to look at this 4th phrase, loyal love. It translates the Hebrew word chesed, which is hard to translate into any language because it combines the ideas of love, generosity, and enduring commitment all into one. Chesed describes an act of promise-keeping loyalty that is motivated by deep personal care. Like in the story of Ruth. Ruth is a foreigner married to an Israelite man, but tragically her husband dies along with his brother and his father. All Ruth has left is her widowed mother-in-law, Naomi, who has nothing to give her. Naomi tells Ruth she should go back to her people, but instead, Ruth promises to stay by Naomi's side and take care of her. And as other people watch Ruth keep this promise over time, they call it an act of chesed. Notice that Ruth's chesed is not conditional or based on Naomi's worth. Rather, it's an expression of Ruth's character. She just is a generous and loving person who keeps her word. That's chesed. Now, Ruth's loyal love is truly inspiring, but the one who shows the most enduring chesed in the Bible is God. Like in the story about Jacob, who is a treacherous liar even to his own family. But despite that, God chooses him and repeats the promise he made to Jacob's grandfather, Abraham, that he would have a huge family through whom God would restore his blessing to the nations. And so 20 years later, when Jacob realizes how undeserving he is, he says to God, "I'm not worthy of all the chesed you've shown me." And he's right. But God's chesed was never about Jacob's worth in the first place. It's a display of God's generous loyalty to his promise. God's chesed continues into the story of Jacob's descendants, the Israelites. When they're enslaved by Pharaoh in Egypt, we're told that God remembered his promise to Abraham and Jacob, so God defeats Egypt and raises up Moses to liberate the people and lead them into the promised land. And in the story, this is called an act of chesed, because it was about God keeping his word. Now, on their way to the promised land, the Israelites are scared of the nations around them, and they doubt that God can protect them. So the people threaten to kill Moses and appoint a new leader to take them back to Egypt. God is understandably hurt and angry, but Moses steps in and says, "Forgive the sin of these people because of your great chesed." Notice that Moses asked God to forgive not because the people deserve it, but because it's consistent with God's own character. And God agrees, and he recommits himself to a people that don't want to be committed to him. In the Bible, God is loyal and loving for no other reason than it's just who God is. Of course, he wants his people to respond with chesed in return, but even when they don't, God's chesed remains. The prophet Hosea compared Israel's chesed to a morning mist that's here one moment and gone the next. But God's chesed is enduring. Like in the celebration of Psalm 136 that opens by saying, "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good," and then 26 times repeats, "His chesed is forever." And so, after centuries of Israel betraying their commitment to God, and after humanity's long history of violence and death, God still kept his promise in a dramatic and drastic way by becoming human and binding himself to us in the person of Jesus. And the people who followed Jesus of Nazareth said that in him they encountered the God of Israel, who is full of loyal love and faithfulness. Jesus is the ultimate loyal and loving human. And in his life, death, and resurrection, God opened up a new future for all of us and for all of creation. And God did this because it's just who God is. Generous, loving, and eternally loyal to his promises. And when we experience the purity and power of God's loyal love shown through Jesus, it compels us to reimagine why and how we can show chesed back to God and to the people around us. This is what it means to say that God is overflowing with loyal love.
God is overflowing with hesed for you. And it answers one of the questions that we have to ask and answer and or re-ask and re-answer, which is there a God? Is there a God? Are we cosmic accidents? Is there meaning and purpose to my life? Or did just something explode, billions of years ago, and I'm going to live and I'm going to die? And when we come to the conclusion that there is a creator God who spoke and created matter out of nothing, and that's where it came from because he's eternally existent, it begs a second question, which is, what is God's intention towards me? Overflowing love. Loyal love that is faithful even when we're not. This has said that we can't even describe in one word. It's generous and it's compassionate and it's merciful and it's good and it's loving and it's faithful and it's overflowing from who he is to you. And this is important because then he wants it to flow through us. I even think it's a valid understanding of the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians. That love is the first word, and he's trying to describe agape or hesed love, that is joy and peace and patience and goodness and kindness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. That this is the loving God of the universe and that he wants to pour it out to us and through us. It's the very kind of love that we just saw at the end of the book of Judges, where they had done such great evil and ended up at rock bottom, and they deserved to be destroyed with the judgment and the wrath of God. But he shows them his loyal love. And we have it on display here in this account in the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth, keyword, hesed. Not only that, the book of Ruth is hesed in dark times. The book begins in darkness. It doesn't end there, but it begins there. Let's just reread our passage. In the days when the judges ruled. By the way, Ruth is a great piece of literature. It has been studied as literature. It's been the model of short story. It is intricate and beautiful and crafted to the finest detail, but it is still presented completely as a true account of historical happenings. This phrase, in the days when the judges ruled, isn't just a once upon a time. It's the kind of language that is used to introduce historical accounts or retellings of what has happened in the past. In the days of the judges, if you weren't here for our study in the book of Judges, I would encourage you to go back and kind of jump into some of that, but it was a dark time. It was full of sin and disorder, and it just kept going downhill. And the people of God were not faithful, but God was faithful. But it was a dark time. And it's set right in the midst of that. And there's a famine in the land, probably because they've turned away from the Lord and they're being oppressed. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. He and his wife and his 2 sons. They had to leave the promised land. They had to go to this place that's east of the Dead Sea, that's not part of the promised land, that there's going to be not a warm welcome and all sorts of trouble. With his wife and the name of his 2 sons, basically sickly and pining, kind of maybe named after moments of their birth or maybe issues with them, and maybe part of that is why they passed away early. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah, and they went into the country of Moab and remained there. So it wasn't just a short sojourn. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died. She loses her husband, and she's left with her 2 sons. And then they take on Moabite wives, which is left ambiguous here, but we know is not the ideal. And the name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth, which is our first bright spot of friend or friendly. And they lived there about 10 years. That's a long sojourn. And both Mahlon and Chilion died. And it leaves both Naomi and Ruth at a terribly dark spot with almost zero hope. And without going into all the reasons why, there's no central government, there's no services, there's no safety net. It is, you're provided for by your family and specifically your husband. And if not your husband, then your surviving sons and households. And this meant that she was in a spot where she was going to face starvation and be open to, criminal intention and all sorts of things. She was without protection. She was without hope. It was dark. I remember being afraid of the dark as a kid. You don't have to admit it, but many of us were, right? I had a nightlight all the time, which is funny. Because now, I'm the guy who brings tape to the hotel to cover up all the the lights that are on. But when I was a kid, I needed light. And sometimes the light made it worse. Because all of a sudden, the shadows that were cast, that's the monster coming out from underneath my bed. And I needed my 8th drink of water. And if you're young parents, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But I think that it's true for all of us. We're all afraid of the dark, and we move from just being literal dark when we're kids to we're afraid of dark times and difficult times as we get older. And this is a dark time. In this life, there is day and night. There's good times and difficult times. And following Jesus doesn't take away all the difficulty of life. But when we trust Jesus fully and we know that he keeps his promises, that he is loyal in his love and his faithfulness to us, and that he will keep his promise that we will be with him forever, it does something to whatever circumstance we're in. Because if our future is anchored in the hope and the reality of life with Jesus forever, it changes how we view and experience the moment that we're in. Whatever kind of darkness it is. Could be loss. You could be grieving or re-grieving. You could be dealing with a diagnosis. You could just be, facing an issue at work or with family or with friends, or all of the different darknesses that creep into our life. And the shadows of the dark are casting shadows, and your heart gets anxious and nervous. But when we know where we're going, we can make sense of where we are. And part of what I want to encourage us in the book of Ruth is that there will be dark times, but we start from this baseline of darkness. And Naomi literally comes back and says, don't call me Naomi. We're going to look at this week. Call me Mara, which means bitter. I have been emptied by the Lord, which is ironic because by the end, she is full and blessed and overflowing. By the way, one of the reasons I think Samuel was the author of both is he has this unique way to use irony to draw attention to things. And the irony in the book of Judges was very dark, and we saw that. But there's this light sense of irony. And we're going to see it next week where Naomi says, I am empty, I have nothing. And she just hasn't read the end of the book yet. And she does not know yet that she's going to be swept up into the genealogy of King Jesus. And God is going to bless her beyond measure. There's this, as we think about being empty and how God is working, I think of Psalm 23, which is a famous psalm. And even if you're new to church, you probably heard this, or maybe even some of you learned it growing up. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and staff, they comfort me. But I just want to pause and say, you and I think because of the way it sounds in the translation and the way that we experience and think about life, we think that there's a break between the two. There's the good section and then there's the hard section, right? But notice, he leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And that path is the valley of the shadow of death or of darkness. And there's an irony here that the loss that Naomi is experiencing is the very thing that is going to lead her to experience what God has for her. And I want to assure you that God is sovereign, that he is providential, that he is working in the midst of what you're facing and what you're experiencing and the loss that you're grieving and the challenges that you're struggling with. And he is bringing about his good purpose and plan in the midst of it. There's one last piece of irony that I want to point out. It's actually the irony that opens the book. We know of Bethlehem from Christmas, right? You know, as soon as you hear Bethlehem in the book of Ruth, it has no place, but we start singing, oh, little town of Bethlehem, da, 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 da. You know, we're singing Christmas songs, not Christmas. But the village name of Bethlehem literally means house of bread. And the irony that opens up the book of Ruth is basically, there was no bread in the house of bread. And that's how we start. And how we end is over 1,000 years later, that in the house of bread, in the city of David, is born a child. And his name is Jesus Christ. And as he does his ministry, he boldly proclaims something that's easy to gloss over. He says, I am the bread of life. And as we come to the table today, we will be celebrating his body that was broken, his blood that was shed. He is nourishment for our soul. He has overflowing love beyond anything that we can understand. And he is working in the midst of your situation and your darkness and the shadows that the nightlight of your life is casting and whatever's going on. He is working in the midst of it to bring about his glory and your good. Let's not forget it. We looked at some of the details of the book of Ruth. We looked at this theme of overflowing loyal love and the overflowing loyal love in dark times. Let's pray as we prepare for the table. Heavenly Father, We only know you because you have chosen to reveal yourself to us. And Lord, honestly, sometimes we come with fear and